What if the WNBA didn't need to overpower the Players Union at all? What if they didn't threaten a lockout, didn't escalate publicly, didn't posture through the media, and still ended up holding all the leverage? Because that's exactly what just happened. While fans were distracted by statements, accusations, and social media outrage, the league quietly shifted the entire negotiation onto a different battlefield. No press conference, no dramatic announcement, just one procedural move that changed everything overnight. And the Players Union didn't seem to realize what it meant until it was already too late. For weeks, the narrative sounded simple. Players wanted more money. Owners were being labeled greedy. Statements framed the dispute as a moral fight instead of a financial one. That kind of framing usually rallies public support. In most sports labor battles, fans instinctively side with players. But this time, something felt off. Instead of digging in, the league stayed calm. Instead of reacting emotionally, ownership stayed procedural. And instead of shutting the league down, they made a decision that looked harmless on the surface, but was devastating underneath. They let the CBA expire, and did nothing. No lockout, no freeze, no panic, just silence. That silence wasn't weakness. It was positioning. Because under U.S. labor law, when a collective bargaining agreement expires without a lockout, the league enters what's called a status quo period. Old rules stay in place. Business continues. And most importantly, free agency doesn't stop. That's the detail almost everyone missed. While the Players Union was telling its members to hold the line, to stay unified, to wait for a better deal, the league was preparing to do something far more effective than arguing. They were about to put real money directly in front of individual players. And once that happens, solidarity stops being theoretical. But this was only the beginning of the pressure. Because the next step didn't just test unity, it tested survival. Most people assumed a lockout was coming. That's how these stories usually go. Talks break down, tempers flare, owners pull the nuclear option, and everyone digs in. When that happens, lines get drawn clearly. Players versus owners. Labor versus management. Good guys and bad guys. But the WNBA didn't do that. And that single choice flipped the entire dynamic. Days before the CBA expired, the league publicly announced they would not lock out players. On the surface, it sounded cooperative, almost soft. But strategically, it was brilliant. By refusing to lock out the union, ownership immediately removed the strongest weapon players typically use in public disputes, victim framing. There were no locked doors. No canceled paychecks. No dramatic shutdown to rally behind. Instead, the league positioned itself as calm, reasonable, and open to business. That mattered more than people realize. In labor disputes, perception shapes pressure. The side that looks unreasonable loses public sympathy, sponsor confidence, and media patience. By choosing not to lock out, the league claimed the moral high ground before the union could. And while the Players Association continued releasing long, emotionally charged statements about fairness and equity, ownership stayed quiet and procedural. No accusations. No slogans. Just policy. That contrast didn't go unnoticed. Fans who initially leaned toward the players began asking uncomfortable questions. If the league wasn't locking anyone out, then why did it feel like the players were escalating? If owners were still willing to operate, why was the union acting like negotiations were being sabotaged? That's when the tone shifted. Because the absence of a lockout didn't stall leverage, it redirected it. Instead of applying pressure collectively, the league prepared to apply it individually. And individual pressure is far harder to resist. While the union was focused on messaging, the league was focused on mechanics. They understood something the players didn't want to acknowledge, yet. You don't have to win the argument if you control the options. And the most powerful option in professional sports isn't rhetoric. It's a contract. That's when the league made its next move. A move that turned theory into reality, and unity into a personal decision. This is where everything stopped being abstract. Because the league didn't threaten the Players Union. They didn't issue ultimatums. They didn't even raise their voice. They simply opened the door to free agency. Quietly, league officials informed teams that they were cleared to begin sending qualifying offers to free agents immediately. Not proposals. Not placeholders. Actual contracts. With actual dollar figures. Fully legal under the expired CBA's status quo rules. And that single detail changed the entire negotiation overnight. Up until this moment, the union's strategy relied on one fragile assumption. That solidarity would hold as long as nothing tangible forced players to choose. As long as everything stayed theoretical, percentages, future revenue, long-term equity, it was easier to stay united. But a qualifying offer isn't theory. It's a number on paper. It's a signature line. It's money that can hit a bank account now. Imagine being a player who made around $90,000 last season. You've been told to wait, to trust the process, to hold the line for the greater good. Then your agent calls and says a team just sent you an offer that doubles, or triples, your salary. Suddenly, the conversation changes. Now it's not about revenue models. It's about rent. It's about student loans. It's about helping your family. It's about security. The union tried to downplay these offers, calling them going through the motions and pointless without a new CBA. But that framing didn't match reality. These contracts were legal, binding, signable, and the moment one player signs, the pressure doesn't just increase, it multiplies. Because solidarity only works when everyone sacrifices equally. The second one person secures their future, everyone else has to ask themselves why they're still waiting. This is where Adam Silver's experience showed. Instead of confronting the union directly, the league let choice do the work. No force, no threats, just options. And options fracture unity faster than any lockout ever could. Players weren't being told what to do. They were being invited to decide. And that's a brutal position for a union to be in. Because unions don't break when leadership loses arguments. They break when members start doing the math. But the pressure didn't stop with contracts. There was another clock ticking in the background, one that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with time. And once that clock runs out, there's no way to reset it. While fans were focused on money and contracts, something far more dangerous was quietly unfolding behind the scenes. The calendar. Because here's the part most people don't realize until it's too late. You cannot build a season without a schedule, and you cannot build a schedule without arenas locked in. And arenas do not wait. The moment the CBA expired without a resolution, league executives started getting nervous, not about salaries but about dates. Prime venues like Barclays Center, Chase Center, Michelob Ultra Arena, and other major WNBA homes are not empty buildings sitting around hoping basketball shows up. They're some of the most in-demand spaces in the country. Concert tours, other sports leagues, corporate events, award shows, all of them are competing for the same dates. Every week without a finalized CBA made those dates vulnerable. If a building doesn't have a confirmed season schedule, it doesn't hold space out of loyalty. It books something else. And once those dates are gone, they're gone. You can't just move a professional sports season around like a pickup game at the park. This is where the union's leverage quietly began to collapse. They believed time was on their side. Training camps weren't scheduled to open for months. Games weren't imminent. On the surface, it looked like there was breathing room. But arena logistics don't work on player timelines. They work on contracts, deposits, and long-term planning. League insiders started warning that if the delay stretched too far, teams could lose access to their own buildings for large chunks of the season. That doesn't just mean fewer games. It means unworkable travel schedules, broken broadcast commitments, and sponsors pulling back because dates aren't guaranteed. And once sponsors hesitate, the financial momentum everyone keeps talking about starts evaporating. This wasn't a hypothetical threat. It was already happening. Behind closed doors, teams were scrambling to protect dates, fielding calls from venue managers asking for clarity the league couldn't yet give. Every unanswered question weakened the league's position, not the owners but the players. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Owners can afford chaos longer than players can. Most WNBA owners are backed by NBA franchises or massive investment groups. A delayed season is an inconvenience. For players, it's missed paychecks, lost exposure, and stalled careers. And the union's public messaging, accusing ownership of running out the clock, was starting to look backward. Because from the outside, it was becoming clear who was actually letting time slip away. The league was moving forward wherever it legally could. Free agency opened. Offers went out. Planning continued. The union stayed planted. And as the days passed, a new realization began to sink in among players. Even if you win the argument, you can still lose the season. That's when patience turns into panic. Because once a season collapses, there's no do-over. No retroactive fixes. No make-up momentum. The Caitlin Clark surge doesn't pause and resume. It fades, and everyone in the room knows it. But that still wasn't the most dangerous fracture forming. The real divide wasn't between players and owners anymore. It was forming inside the locker room itself. And that's when things get truly unstable. This is the moment where labor disputes usually stop being theoretical and start getting personal. Because solidarity sounds strong in a statement. It sounds powerful on social media. It sounds noble when everyone's speaking in percentages and principles. But solidarity gets tested the second real money lands in front of real people. Once qualifying offers started circulating, the union's biggest fear quietly became reality. Players weren't just hearing promises anymore. They were seeing numbers, actual contracts, guaranteed figures that didn't depend on projections, media deals, or future growth. And that changed everything. Imagine being a role player who's been grinding for years, making low six figures, flying commercial, playing overseas just to stay afloat. You've listened to leadership tell you to hold the line. That waiting will get you something historic. Then your agent calls. And suddenly, the number on the page is double what you made last year. Maybe triple. Maybe with a team that gives you visibility, marketing opportunities, and stability you've never had before. At that point, this isn't ideology anymore. It's life math. This is where the union's messaging started to wobble. They publicly dismissed free agency offers as going through the motions, calling them meaningless without a finalized CBA. But privately, players knew better. These contracts were legal under the status quo. They could be signed immediately. And the moment the first player signs, everything changes. Because solidarity doesn't collapse all at once. It erodes, quietly, one decision at a time. A veteran nearing the end of her career thinks, "This might be my last real chance." A younger player thinks, "Why am I sacrificing my future for a fight I didn't start?" A mid-tier player thinks, "If I wait and the season collapses, who protects me?" Those are not selfish questions. They're human ones. And here's where Adam Silver's move becomes devastatingly effective. By allowing teams to make offers, the league didn't attack the union publicly. They didn't issue threats. They didn't escalate rhetoric. They simply presented options. And options create division. Because now, union leadership isn't negotiating against owners anymore. They're negotiating against individual incentives inside their own membership. That's the hardest fight to win. The league understood something the union underestimated. Most players don't experience this sport as a political platform. They experience it as a job. One that doesn't last long. One that can disappear with a single injury. As the days passed, whispers started circulating. Who's getting offers? Which teams are being aggressive? Who's quietly considering signing? No announcements. No press releases. Just tension. And once players start wondering who might break ranks first, solidarity becomes suspicion. But the fracture didn't stop there. Because there was another divide growing beneath the surface. One that had nothing to do with money at all. It was generational. And that divide might end up defining how this entire standoff is remembered. What started as a labor dispute quietly turned into something much more uncomfortable. A divide inside the locker room. On one side, veteran players who spent years in a league that barely paid enough to survive. Long flights, minimal exposure, overseas seasons just to make ends meet. For them, this negotiation feels personal. It feels overdue. It feels like the last chance to correct decades of being overlooked. On the other side, a new wave of players who entered the league during its most explosive moment of growth. Players who saw packed arenas, record-breaking ratings, endorsement opportunities, and a spotlight that didn't exist 5 years ago. And those two perspectives don't always align. Veterans see sacrifice. They remember when nobody cared. They believe holding the line now is about honoring everything they endured. To them, this isn't just a contract. It's a statement. Younger players see momentum. They see opportunity that can vanish if mishandled. They watched millions of new fans flood into the league almost overnight. They understand that growth is fragile, and that once casual fans leave, they don't always come back. That difference in outlook matters. Because when leadership is dominated by players nearing the end of their careers, the incentives change. A veteran in her final seasons benefits from immediate salary spikes. Long-term league stability matters, but not as much as maximizing the window that's left. A rookie or second-year player thinks differently. She's asking, what does this league look like in 5 years? What happens if this season disappears? Who takes the blame if fans walk away? And that's where resentment starts to form. Quietly. Not in public statements, but in conversations with agents, in private group chats, in offhand comments that stopped sounding unified. This generational tension was already there before negotiations even began. The arrival of Caitlin Clark amplified it. The sudden influx of attention didn't feel earned to everyone. Some veterans felt erased by the spotlight. Others felt the league finally had what it always needed. Instead of embracing that moment, parts of the union leadership leaned into hostility, toward fans, toward media, toward anyone questioning their approach. That strategy may have energized a core group, but it alienated the audience that just showed up. And now, during the most sensitive negotiation in league history, those same fans are watching players turn down massive raises while accusing ownership of bad faith. Optics matter. And right now, the optics are brutal. Because while the union frames this as a moral stand, the public sees something else. They see players rejecting offers that would dramatically change their lives. They see rhetoric escalating while the league stays quiet and procedural. That perception doesn't help negotiations. It hardens positions. And here's the most dangerous part. Younger players are watching this play out in real time, learning who actually controls outcomes. They're realizing that leverage isn't declared, it's proven. The veterans believe unity forces concessions. The younger players are starting to see that money talks louder than manifestos. And when that realization sets in, the union doesn't just risk losing this negotiation. It risks losing its authority. Because once players stop believing leadership is acting in their individual best interest, everything changes. And that leads directly to the next phase of this standoff, the moment when time itself becomes the league's strongest weapon. And that's where the pressure truly starts to suffocate. At first, the union believed time was on their side. Training camps were still months away. The season felt distant. On paper, it looked like there was plenty of runway to apply pressure, shape the narrative, and force ownership to blink. But behind the scenes, the clock was already working against them. Because professional sports don't run on vibes or statements. They run on logistics. Arena calendars don't wait for labor disputes to resolve themselves. They get filled. Quietly. Efficiently. Permanently. Every day without a finalized schedule is another day venue managers open their books to concerts, conventions, and other leagues that are ready to commit. And once those dates are gone, they don't come back. That reality hit when league insiders began raising concerns about scheduling conflicts. Not hypotheticals. Real warnings. The longer this dragged out, the harder it became to guarantee the season could even be staged properly, especially in shared NBA arenas where the WNBA is already second in priority. The union didn't publicly address that risk. The league didn't have to, because silence, in this case, was strategy. While the Players Association was releasing emotional statements, ownership was quietly allowing the calendar to tighten. No threats. No ultimatums. Just letting reality do the work. Then free agency entered the picture. Under U.S. labor law, once the CBA expired and talks failed to extend, the league entered a status quo period. Same rules. Same salary structures. But with one massive change. Teams could make offers. Real offers. Not projections. Not promises tied to future agreements. Actual contracts with actual numbers, legally binding the moment a player signed. That's when the pressure became personal. Because you can argue philosophy in a group meeting. You can hold the line when the sacrifice is abstract. But when an agent calls and says, "This is on the table right now," theory collapses fast. Especially for players who aren't stars. Especially for players who've spent years making low six figures while balancing overseas seasons, family obligations, and physical wear. For them, time isn't a tactic. It's a threat. Every week without a deal means lost earning windows, lost visibility, lost leverage, and potentially lost seasons. Ownership understands this dynamic better than anyone. They don't need to lock players out. They don't need to escalate. They just need to wait. Because time pressures players differently than it pressures owners. NBA-backed franchises can absorb delays. Investors can withstand uncertainty. Players live season to season. And once time becomes asymmetric like that, power shifts. The union believed solidarity would hold. But solidarity is easiest before money appears. The moment it does, every player starts doing math. Not ideological math. Personal math. Rent. Loans. Career timelines. Injury risk. And once those calculations start happening privately, unity begins to fracture quietly. That's the moment negotiations stop being theoretical. And in the next phase, the league makes its most subtle move yet, one that doesn't target leadership. It targets individuals. And that changes everything. This is the point where everything shifts. Not publicly, not with a press conference, but in silence. Because the moment individual offers start circulating, the entire structure the union depends on begins to strain. For months, players were told to hold the line. That unity was leverage. That patience would force ownership to cave. It sounded strong in theory, especially when repeated in group settings, statements, and interviews. But then the offers arrived. And suddenly, solidarity wasn't a slogan anymore. It was a decision, one that came with consequences. Imagine being a rotation player making just over 6 figures. Not a star, not a household name. Someone who doesn't have endorsement deals or guaranteed long-term security. You've been told to wait, to trust the process, to believe that holding out benefits everyone. Then your agent calls. A real team, a real contract, a number that doubles what you made last season. That changes the conversation instantly, because now the sacrifice is no longer symbolic. It's measurable. The union can call free agency pointless. They can say offers don't matter without a new CBA. But players know better. Those contracts are legal. Those dollars are real. And the risk of turning them down is personal. This is where union leadership faces its hardest challenge, something no statement can fix. They cannot stop teams from making offers. They cannot prevent agents from advising their clients. And they cannot force players to prioritize collective goals over individual futures. All they can do is ask. And asking only works when trust is intact. But trust is fragile, especially after months of rhetoric that alienated fans, polarized media, and framed negotiations as moral battles instead of business realities. Some players began quietly questioning whether leadership was negotiating for the group, or for those with the least to lose. Veterans nearing the end of their careers can afford risk. Younger players can't. That difference matters more than ideology. Because for a rookie or second-year player, one strong contract can change the trajectory of an entire career. It can mean stability. It can mean staying stateside instead of overseas. It can mean finally building a brand while the spotlight is hot. And now, those opportunities are being placed directly in front of them, one by one. This is why ownership's move was so effective. They didn't attack the union. They didn't escalate the dispute. They simply let reality seep in. And once reality enters the room, belief systems get tested. Some players will hold the line. Others won't. Not because they're greedy. Not because they're disloyal. But because professional athletes have short careers, and missed windows don't reopen. The moment the first player signs, everything accelerates. Pressure multiplies. Whispers become conversations. Conversations become decisions. And suddenly, the union isn't negotiating with ownership anymore. It's negotiating with its own members. That's the point where power truly shifts. Because leagues can survive fractured unions. Unions rarely survive fractured belief. And as this standoff continues, one question looms larger than all the rest. How long can solidarity hold when reality keeps knocking? Because the longer this drags on, the harder it becomes to pretend that this is still about principle, and not about survival. And once that line blurs, the endgame becomes inevitable. Here's the part most people miss when they talk about leverage. Leverage isn't what you say you have. It's what the other side believes you're willing and able to sustain. And right now, the league understands something the union is only beginning to feel. The pressure isn't evenly distributed. Ownership can wait. Players can't. Every additional day without a deal creates invisible damage that doesn't show up in headlines. Agents start advising differently. Sponsors hesitate. Training plans get disrupted. Overseas options shrink as uncertainty grows. And most importantly, trust inside the union continues to thin. Because when leadership keeps saying, hold the line, but can't explain how long or at what cost, players start asking questions that don't have comforting answers. What happens if camps are delayed? What happens if arena dates are lost? What happens if this season becomes shorter or disappears entirely? Those aren't scare tactics. They're logistical realities. And the league hasn't had to threaten any of it. That's the brilliance of the strategy. By simply allowing free agency to proceed under status quo rules, ownership shifted the emotional burden onto the players. Every unsigned contract becomes a reminder of what's being risked. Every accepted offer becomes a signal that unity is cracking. This is how leverage dies, not in a dramatic collapse, but in small, irreversible steps. One signature, one announcement, one player choosing certainty over ideology. And once that happens, leadership loses its most powerful weapon, the ability to claim unanimity. Because from that moment forward, every player who doesn't sign is making a conscious choice to sacrifice real money. That's a hard ask in a league where careers are short and injury risk is constant. The union's messaging still sounds confident, still defiant. But confidence without control doesn't hold. Ownership knows they don't need to win an argument. They just need players to make decisions. And players are doing exactly that. Quietly, carefully, individually. The longer this continues, the clearer the outcome becomes. Not because one side is evil or the other is virtuous, but because economics always outlast emotion. This isn't a standoff anymore. It's a countdown. And in the final phase of this dispute, only one thing will matter. Who blinks first when theory collides with real life? Here's the part nobody wants to say out loud yet. The real damage doesn't happen in public statements or viral clips. It happens behind closed doors, in agent phone calls, group chats, and private conversations players swear will never leak. This is where solidarity starts to bend. Because once qualifying offers exist, the fight stops being ideological and starts becoming personal. Every player is suddenly forced to answer a question they didn't have to face before. What is my number? Not the union's number. My number. And that's a dangerous moment for any players' association. Veteran leaders can talk about long-term vision all day, but the league just introduced short-term reality into the equation. And reality has a way of cutting through speeches. Imagine a player who's been grinding for years. Overseas flights, short off-seasons, injuries that never quite heal. She's told to hold the line, trust the process, believe in collective leverage. Then her agent calls and says, "This team is ready to double your salary, right now." That changes everything. Because at that moment, saying no doesn't feel like strategy anymore. It feels like sacrifice. And sacrifice is easy to preach when you're not the one paying for it. That's how fractures begin, not with rebellion, but with hesitation. No one announces they're breaking ranks. They just stop pushing as hard. They stop posting. They stop echoing the talking points. They go quiet. And silence is the first crack in unity. But here's what makes this even more complicated. Some players don't just see these offers as money. They see them as opportunity. A chance to land in bigger markets. A chance to play alongside the league's most visible stars. A chance to grow a brand while the spotlight is still hot. And that brings us to the unspoken tension nobody wants to address yet. Because the moment individual opportunity enters the room, collective leverage starts leaking out the door. And the league knows it. That's not accidental. That's leverage applied without raising its voice. But what happens when the first player signs? Not the headline star. Not the union rep. Just one name on a contract. That's when everything accelerates. Here's the truth about labor standoffs that history keeps proving over and over again. It never collapses all at once. It collapses one name at a time. The moment the first player signs a qualifying offer, the entire power dynamic shifts. Not because that player betrayed anyone, but because the illusion of perfect unity is gone. And once that illusion breaks, everyone else starts recalculating. Phones light up. Agents start calling other agents. Players start quietly asking questions they wouldn't dare say publicly. Who signed? How much? Which team? What does this mean for me? And suddenly, the union isn't speaking with one voice anymore. It's trying to keep up with dozens of private decisions happening in parallel. This is why owners don't need press conferences right now. They don't need to win the argument online. They only need one agreement to exist. Because once one player locks in guaranteed money, every other player feels the pressure immediately. Not from ownership, but from time. Now the question isn't should we hold the line. It becomes what if I wait and miss my spot? Roster slots are finite. Cap space moves fast. The best landing spots disappear first. And players know that. Especially the ones trying to break into rotation roles, endorsement opportunities, or bigger markets. This is where fear enters the room. Fear of being left behind. Fear of trusting leadership too long. Fear that loyalty won't be rewarded the same way money is. And fear spreads faster than confidence. What makes this even messier is that the players most likely to sign first aren't the stars. They're the middle tier. the ones with the least job security and the most to lose. And once that group starts moving, the union's leverage doesn't just weaken, it evaporates. Because leadership can't punish players for securing their futures. They can't publicly shame them. They can't stop teams from offering contracts. All they can do is ask for patience. And patience gets harder to sell when rent is due. Meanwhile, ownership doesn't have to rush. They're watching the board exactly like a chess player does, waiting to see which piece moves first, because once it does, the endgame becomes obvious. And that leads to the moment no one wants to imagine yet. What happens if the union loses control of the timeline? Because once timing slips away, outcomes follow whether you're ready or not. And the clock is already ticking. Here's the part most fans never see, because it doesn't happen on social media. It happens quietly, privately, behind closed doors. This is where unions don't explode, they fracture. No statement gets released. No emergency press conference. No dramatic resignation. Instead, something far more dangerous happens. Players stop trusting the process at the same time, but for different reasons. Some feel misled. Some feel rushed. Some feel like the deal they were promised keeps moving further away. And once that doubt creeps in, conversations change. Group chats go silent. Union calls feel tense. Questions stop being asked publicly and start being asked one-on-one with agents. That's the moment leadership loses control. Not because they're wrong, but because they can no longer guarantee outcomes. And here's the brutal reality. Most players are not negotiating legacy. They're negotiating survival. A veteran nearing the end of her career sees this as the last contract that matters. A younger player sees this as the first chance to stabilize her life. A fringe player sees this as the difference between staying in the league or being replaced. Those motivations are not aligned, even if the message is. That's why solidarity sounds strong in theory, but collapses under real-world pressure. Because every day without a deal doesn't cost everyone equally. Some players can wait. Most cannot. And ownership understands that better than anyone. They don't need to win the moral argument. They don't need fans cheering them on. They only need time, because time exposes differences inside the union that no amount of messaging can hide. This is when players begin telling themselves things they never planned to say out loud. I'll just sign now and support the union later. I'm not crossing anyone, I'm just protecting myself. If this falls apart, I don't want to be the one left with nothing. And once that mindset spreads, unity becomes symbolic instead of functional. What's dangerous isn't that players will sign. It's that they'll sign quietly, without drama, without noise, until suddenly half the league has made decisions the union can't reverse. And by the time anyone realizes what's happening, it's already too late to stop. Because the leverage didn't disappear in a headline. It disappeared in silence. And the next phase of this story isn't about statements or negotiations anymore. It's about consequences. And those consequences are coming fast. This is where everything becomes irreversible. Because once silence turns into signatures, the negotiation stops being theoretical. It becomes real life, with real winners and real losers. At this stage, ownership doesn't even need to push anymore. Momentum does the work for them. Teams start filling rosters quietly. Cap space starts disappearing. Agents stop talking about principles and start talking about availability. And the union suddenly finds itself reacting instead of leading. Here's what changes instantly once control is lost. Leverage doesn't just weaken, it flips. Now the league isn't worried about pressure from the players. The players are worried about being left out of the next wave. Because the truth is brutal but simple. The WNBA can move forward without individual players. Individual players cannot move forward without the league. That's not disrespect, that's structure. And the players who sign early? They don't look reckless anymore. They look prepared. They look like they read the room. They look like they secured their future while others waited for a perfect outcome that never arrived. That creates resentment. Not outwardly at first, but internally. Why did she sign already? Why did she get that deal? Why am I still waiting? Now imagine leadership trying to rally unity in that environment. Every message lands softer. Every call feels heavier. Every assurance sounds less certain than the one before. Because leadership can't undo signed contracts. They can't pull players back. They can't stop teams from moving forward. All they can do is hope enough players stay patient long enough to regain footing. And hope is not a strategy. Meanwhile, the league keeps operating calmly. No panic. No threats. No public drama. Just steady progression. Exactly the opposite of what the union expected. This is the moment when players realize something uncomfortable. The fight didn't end because ownership crushed the union. It ended because time did. And once that realization sets in, the final phase begins. Not negotiations. Not statements. Acceptance. Here's the part no one wants to admit out loud, but it's the truth. This outcome wasn't decided by greed. It wasn't decided by villains or heroes. It was decided by leverage and timing. The Players Union believed momentum was on their side because the league just had its biggest year ever. Attendance surged. Ratings jumped. Merchandise flew off shelves. And for the first time, the WNBA felt culturally unavoidable. But momentum is not leverage. Leverage is the ability to force outcomes. And when the CBA expired without a deal, ownership didn't panic. They waited. They knew something the union underestimated. Most players can't afford uncertainty longer than owners can. And once qualifying offers entered the picture, the math changed instantly. Suddenly, this wasn't about percentages, principles, or long-term visions. It was about security, stability, a guaranteed check versus a promised future. That's when reality took over. Because no matter how strong the messaging, no union can survive when individual incentives outweigh collective sacrifice. Especially in a league where careers are short, salaries are limited, and financial windows close fast. This doesn't mean the players were wrong to ask for more. It means they misjudged when to ask. The smarter play would have been patience, letting new media money arrive, letting revenue stabilize, letting proof replace projections. Instead, the standoff came too early, before the league's growth could harden into leverage. Ownership didn't crush the union with force. They let economics do it quietly. And now the path forward is clear. A deal will get done. It always does. But it won't look as bold as what was demanded. And it won't feel like a victory the way it was imagined. It will feel like compromise. The league will move forward. The season will happen. And players will get paid more than before, but less than they hoped. And years from now, this moment will be studied as a lesson in labor dynamics, timing, and power. Not because one side was evil, but because one side misread the board. That's how these stories usually end. If you want breakdowns like this, no fluff, no slogans, just real analysis of what's happening behind the scenes, make sure you subscribe to Basket now. Hit the like button if this helped you understand the situation more clearly, and drop your take in the comments. Do you think the Players Union played this wrong, or was this the only move they had? Because the next chapter of the WNBA isn't about negotiations anymore. It's about what lessons actually stick.